These two reporters wrote this book, and they said, I want a moat with alligator snakes, electrified fences, so people get electrocuted if they so much as touch the fence, and spikes on top. Never said it, never thought of it. It was a lie. Just so you have it, you asked the question. It was a total lie. It was corrupt reporting, okay?
President Trump kept saying they were Washington Post reporters. They're not. And speaking from years of experience, I can tell you the Times doesn't publish fake news. Its reporters aren't corrupt. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. We'll talk immigration in just a second. Also on tap today, Bill Cunningham was a legend at the Times. His on-the-street photos created countless fashion trends. Some of his thousands of pictures collected in a new book. We'll talk about Cunningham's career with the Times style photo editor who worked with him for more than 2 decades. But we begin with a book that seems to have enraged the president. It's called Border Wars: Inside Trump's Assault on Immigration. Trump began his campaign by trashing Mexican immigrants as murderers and rapists. Restricting immigration is his absolute core issue. He's blocked refugees and asylum seekers, separated families, put children in cages, had agents raid workplaces looking for undocumented workers, and ramped up deportations. And new administration data reveals that 1 million migrants were taken into custody at southern borders in the year ending September 30th. Border Wars is an inside account of how Trump is carrying out this immigration crackdown. The book is by Michael Shear, White House correspondent for the New York Times, Julie Hirschfeld Davis, Times congressional correspondent. Joe Klein in the New York Times Book Review called this book exquisitely reported and called the authors, Michael Shear and Julie Hirschfeld Davis, scrupulously fair reporters. Now, we saw those statistics. We saw what Donald Trump has done. Put in perspective, what is better or what is worse than the immigration mess, which we would all agree it is, since the Obama administration?
Well, I think part of the reason we decided to write the book is that there isn't really an argument on any side of the political spectrum about whether or not there's a problem at the border. Democrats, Republicans, they all agree that the immigration system in the United States doesn't work as it should. The disagreement comes in how you solve the problem, what solutions, how do you confront, how do you first define the problem, and then what solutions do you put in place to fix it. What Donald Trump, and that debate has been going on for a long time. Republicans and Democrats have struggled for decades. Julie and I covered a lot of that debate over the years, and that hasn't been an easy one. Donald Trump and the people that he brought in with him, though, didn't come in with an eye towards finding that middle ground between the left and the right that was going to solve the problem. They came in with an eye towards imposing a set of restrictionist ideas that in the president's case comes from sort of gut instinct and impulse, and in the case of the people he brings around him have really been trying to put forward for years, people like Stephen Miller, who have been on Capitol Hill largely frustrated that their hardcore ideas haven't been put in place. And they came in office determined to impose them by any way possible, by legislation if they could, or by essentially executive fiat, which is really what they've had to try to do because the legislative path has been sort of blocked to them.
Julie?
And what's been ironic, I think, and we document this in the book, is how sort of the more aggressive their policies and their ideas got, the less effective it actually became. When Trump first came in the beginning of 2017, he had been talking so tough on the campaign trail about how he was going to crack down and have mass raids and deportations that they did actually see a dip early on. They started to call it the Trump effect in people showing up at the southern border because they were worried that this crackdown was coming. But what you see very quickly thereafter is that people realized, well, actually, the policies haven't changed. And then as they sort of embarked on this series of very restrictive measures that they hadn't really thought through adequately, the travel ban, then family separation, all the rest, what happened was you saw an uptick, and the uptick grew and grew and grew, and only when the family separation policy became something that was generating a lot of attention did they see a slight downward trend at the border. And then that was the very moment that the president and his advisors all decided it was too controversial. They pulled it back and saw very quickly that it came back up again. So it's ironic that they haven't actually managed to have the deterrent effect that they wanted.
But it's having a good political effect for the president,
No
is it
question.
not?
Well, yes. I mean, the president and the people around him are convinced that it is good politically for him, at least in firing up his base and in being able to make the case that he is following through on the central promise, really, of his candidacy. I think there is still an open question about whether ultimately it will be good politically because it repels kind of the rest of the political spectrum, right? The people who are obviously Democrats, but also people in the middle. And we saw that in the midterm elections where the president really tripled down on the anti-immigrant theme for the midterm elections run up to election day. He talked about the caravans over and over and over again. And ultimately, I think Republican pollsters that we talked to for the book concluded that it had actually hurt the Republican Party more than it had helped, because it meant that they weren't talking about tax cuts and the economy and other things that they might have been talking about. And I think it's an open question for 2020.
So in border wars, do we suggest that the president becomes more and more desperate, that we start shooting immigrants in the legs, that we end birthright citizenship, that we fill a moat with crocodiles and snakes? I mean, do we really go to these lengths to keep people out of the country, shut down the border entirely?
I think that is what we see, and what we sort of try to lay out in the book is, he comes in, has made all these big promises about what he's going to do, building a big wall, having this, big deterrent effect, being tougher, and becomes very frustrated when at almost every meeting, in almost every private conversation with his advisors, they're telling him, no, we can't do that, sir, and no, we can't do this, and here's why, and procurement takes a long time, and you have to get permission from the landowners on the border, and all of these things that, as somebody who's never been in politics before, it's never occurred to him, and he really has no interest in hearing them. And he doesn't want to take a detailed briefing on pretty much anything, and so he becomes more and more frustrated at being told that the things that are occurring to him just can't be done. And one of the things that he talked about last summer publicly was that he wanted the military or border agents to start using their rifles when they got rocks thrown at them. And he's told very, very quickly by his advisors privately, no, sir, that cannot happen. We do not use lethal force against people who are not posing a real lethal threat. And when he hears that, he then wants to know, well, why can't we just not use lethal force, but still shoot? He's fixated on this idea that we have to do something to hold people back, and very frustrated by the notion that our policy really and international law essentially dictates that when people show up and present themselves and say, I have fear of returning, that they can't just say no and block them.
So what can we do? I mean, he has a point, of course, and you can understand the frustration. Assuming the president doesn't get more and more desperate or more imaginative, what is the answer?
I mean, look, there isn't a simple answer. I think we certainly knew that probably going into the book, and I think came away from writing the book more convinced than ever that there isn't one single thing you can do. There's a lot of proposals out there. First among them, we've got an immense backlog in the immigration court system, and that creates a lot of the problems, because when immigrants can't find a legal way to get into the country, a Mexican immigrant who wants to try to come legally faces backlogs that could be 30, 40 years on a waiting list. And so advocates who describe other ways of going about this talk about clearing out that backlog, hiring more judges to do that, and ultimately increasing, I mean, the advocates on the other side of where President Trump is would say increasing the amount of legal immigration as a way to take the pressure off of the illegal immigration is one of the solutions. But President Trump and the people around him want to cut legal immigration as well. And so I think a lot of folks look at what the president and the administration is trying to do and say, that doesn't it doesn't really work.
Michael and Julie, obviously the president wants to scare parents into not coming to this country, but if any other country put kids in cages, wouldn't we be yelling about human rights violations?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, there was lots of yelling about human rights violations when the public got wind of the family separation policy. It's worth noting, by the way, and the president says this early and often when this issue comes up, that President Obama faced this challenge, and their answer was, we're going to detain all these families together. And then they got criticized very harshly, and some of the same advocacy groups really savaged President Obama for having, detained children along with their parents. But the problem is, there is this surge that comes up from Central America. It's been a thing that's been happening for several years now, and there's really under the system that we have now, where the asylum rules are what they are, and there is such a huge backlog in the system, there is no effective way of handling this volume of people, and I think that's what both presidents found, but they just went about the challenge in very different ways.
The Obama people considered separating families and ultimately decided that was a line that they weren't willing to cross. We talk about that in the book. We also document many of these Central American kids that were separated when we document a lot of the diplomatic conversation between those Central American countries, the leadership and the foreign policy folks in those countries, who made the point that you just made, which is, the line that we put in the book is that they said to American officials, "You've kidnapped our kids," right? And made the point to the American officials that if the situation had been reversed, American officials and the families would be completely outraged. The idea that thousands of American kids would have been taken from their parents at the border, and held essentially in a foreign country, and I think that was part of the immense pressure that ultimately led the president to back down.
Let me ask you about another issue somewhat related, and that obviously is impeachment. This is a running issue that changes by the minute, but what legally could Congress do if the president stonewalls? Who makes a decision as to who has legal supremacy here? Congress says, we want this, the president says no. What happens next?
Well, ultimately, there is a scenario where it's the Supreme Court, it's the court system, and ultimately the Supreme Court that would decide questions like that. But the question that we're facing here is whether the House Democrats will even go that route, because they've sort of started down that road, or tried to start down that road, in the wake of the Mueller report, trying to get the underlying grand jury information that informed the Mueller report that was part of that investigation, and trying to get access to key witnesses in that inquiry, and were stonewalled by the White House and have gone to court. And they've actually had some success in court, but it's taking a long time. And I think there's been a decision already made at the highest levels of Democratic leadership that they do not want to spend all of this time, have all these months pass. Meanwhile, President Trump has a big megaphone to set the narrative in whatever politically advantageous way he wants to, while this makes its way up to the Supreme Court. I think what we're going to see is they're going to act very quickly. They're going to take what evidence they can get, be it from officials who have already left the administration and are no longer under the control of the White House, or elsewhere, and then go forward with as strong of a case as they can make without the cooperation of the White House.
And can those people who have left the White House no longer, can claim executive privilege, when they get a subpoena from Congress, do they have any recourse to ignore it legally?
Well, then it becomes a question for them individually, and in some cases they will have documents and potentially material they could testify to that would be subject to some sort of restriction, but it's really at that point up to them as a private citizen whether they want to cooperate. And what we're told is that the former ambassador, for instance, Ambassador Yovanovitch, who was scheduled to be deposed and is now scheduled for an interview, does want to cooperate. So there is a potential for some of these people to talk, and we've already seen one official, Kurt Volker, who had resigned, went up there and was interviewed, and it was quite fruitful.
So what happens, and obviously this is very hypothetical, Peter Baker reports at the Times, our colleague, that the president assumes now that he's going to be impeached, wants to delegitimize the process. The Republicans in the Senate, as of this point, are not likely to convict. So he runs for re-election and is impeached by the House and says this is not a fair process and possibly gets re-elected.
Yeah, it would be, the previous impeachment efforts, inquiries over the last few decades have largely been of officials in second terms, right? Not the first term. So this would be a unique moment in American history if that were to play out that way, where there would have been an impeachment and yet the president goes on to win a second term. And I think that handcuffs the Democrats a little bit as to what they can potentially do. I don't think there's any constitutional or legal prohibitions on them trying to go after the president again in a second term, but I think politically it would be difficult. And, so they, I think, and yet I don't think that there's much choice. The politics are what they are now, and I think they're going forward, and it will play out in the next few months.
Okay, Michael Shear, Julie Hirschfeld Davis. The book is Border Wars, exquisitely reported, Joe Klein said in the New York Times. And coming up next, Bill Cunningham, his photos on the street. He was arguably one of the most influential photographers of his time. We'll show you his work. Hear from Time's style photo editor who worked with him. Bill Cunningham didn't take his photos on she fashion runways or in lavishly decorated studios. He rode around the city on his bicycle and took pictures on the street. He was one of the world's most famous fashion photographers. His pictures set off fashion trends, but he didn't think of himself as a photographer. He said he was a columnist who writes with pictures. It's fair to say he was the original influencer, long before there was Instagram and YouTube. Many of his pictures collected now in a beautiful new book called Bill Cunningham on the Street. Tiina Loite, a former Times style photo editor, she wrote the preface and an essay for the book and was a colleague and good friend of Bill Cunningham for many years. Tiina, when you put these pictures together in the book, what do you think people will walk away from when they look at the cumulative body of work here?
Well, they're also getting a chance to see the pictures removed from the format of Bill's columns. Bill's street columns would have anywhere from 20 to even 60 or 70 pictures.
As many as he could cram in.
As many as he could cram in there. And I wanted this book to be a photography book. So many of Bill's pictures were wonderful on their own, and I just wanted the photographs to be photographs.
That dog in the fur coat.
The dog in the mink coat. That was actually one of the last pictures I found before the deadline. But there were just so many wonderful pictures that ran so tiny and were part of a mosaic. And I think it was important. I thought it was important for people to see the pictures on their own.
What did he look for when he was taking pictures?
He didn't always know. He stood on the corner. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of fashion, and he could see.
He was a designer himself in the beginning.
He was a hat designer. Yeah, he was a milliner, and he might have been the only person to ever drop out of Harvard to become a milliner. But he would see people walk by, he would notice trends, and so many of his columns had a theme, everybody's wearing yellow or everybody's wearing pink in the winter. And sometimes his columns were simply, teenagers, or this is what everybody wore to go see Lady Gaga. He stumbled upon style everywhere. Style, he could find style anywhere. He had an eye for that.
How many photographs did you have to go through for the book?
It was impossible to count. He shot so much. He was on the street all day long. He went to events in the evening. There was just an enormous amount of material, and there was even a lot missing. There was a lot of pictures that we remember that I couldn't find.
Thanks to Jeff Roth and our
yes,
morgue.
Jeff, had a box of printouts that had code numbers on them that I was able to find some pictures that way. But
and he saved everything.
He saved everything. He saved everything the way an archivist would. When you go through his folders, it's like, what is all this stuff? He's got articles stuffed in there. He's got invitations, but it wasn't the method. He wasn't a hoarder. He was an archivist. He knew that information was important. He sometimes had articles from different newspapers simply because there were pictures of the same people, and he could identify people that way.
Now, speaking of identifying people, when he photographed Greta Garbo, did he really not know that it was she?
So he says.
Okay. But why did he photograph her? What?
The coat. He noticed the coat. It's always about the clothing. He would go to the Met Gala every year, and we would have to help him identify the celebrities the next day because he simply didn't know who these people were. He didn't have a television set, and he didn't follow that. But it was always about the clothes. It was always the ensemble.
And did he really go to these 1 hour developing things for his film?
He did. When the Times went digital, he did not. And he chose to shoot film. And Bill operated in his own universe, so, we thought we'd let him become digital when he was ready to become digital. But he would take his film to these 1 hour photomats that were all over the place at the time, but they started to die out. And I think, he did go to a drugstore. Then his film was sent to professional labs, but again, those also started to slowly dwindle. Eventually, he did go digital.
He worked for the Times for a long time before he went on staff. He said,
Yes.
Money is the cheapest thing. To him, what was better than money?
Freedom. Absolutely. Being able to go to shoot when he wanted, where he wanted, and to not have anybody lording over him, telling him what to do.
You arranged the book by decade.
Yes.
Is there a thread for each decade that ties them together, do you think?
Because there were so many pictures, because there was such a vast number of photographs to go through, we thought organizing it by decade made the most sense. And it flows from page to page. I did not want to recreate the columns necessarily. There are never more than 4 pictures on a page, but there is a flow through each decade. It's essentially, when you're telling the history of Bill Cunningham, you're telling the history of fashion.
And it's interesting that you're talking about history, whereas Bill was not interested in nostalgia. He said fashion is about today.
Fashion is about today, but because he was so well versed in this, because he had such a mission and such a passion, he also recognized, he would look at an ensemble and also be reminded of a designer who might have conjured that up 30 years ago. And he would write about this. He had copy accompanying all of his columns, and he would enhance what he was trying to tell people with also providing a little bit of the background.
Because he had so much of that rich history.
So much, yes.
That's fabulous. A great book to look at and to read. Thanks to Tiina Loite. The book is On the Street. Bill Cunningham, 5 Decades of Iconic Photography. I'll add my thoughts on CODA coming up next. When the Democrats debate again next week, Bill de Blasio won't be among them, for the first time by choice. He prudently jumped off the stage before he was pushed. He had failed to raise enough money or support in the polls to qualify. You might not know it from his miserable ratings at home, but the mayor prefers to be out meeting and greeting voters more than engaging in the nitty-gritty management of the city. He personifies a favorite maxim of Mario Cuomo: campaigning is poetry, governing is prose. That's especially true if you're governing as a mayor. De Blasio's short-lived campaign affirmed another verity about the mayoralty of New York City. It's been a political dead end since the 19th century. Edward Livingston became a senator from Louisiana. DeWitt Clinton was elected governor. In 1868, Mayor John T. Hoffman ran for governor against 2 rivals, including Mark Twain. I somehow felt, Twain later wrote, that I had one prominent advantage over these gentlemen, and that was good character. Hoffman won anyway. That same year, Congressman Fernando Wood, another former mayor and a Confederate sympathizer, was formally censured by his congressional colleagues. he was accused of doing what many New Yorkers do naturally, bluntly speaking his mind. Theodore Roosevelt lost the mayoralty, but parlayed his record as police commissioner into the governorship and later was elected vice president and president. What's behind the City Hall jinx? First, no mayor of any city has been elected president since Calvin Coolidge in 1924. Also, what happens in Northampton, Massachusetts, in Coolidge's case, or South Bend, Indiana, may stay there, but not New York. 6 decades ago, Wallace Sayre and Herbert Kaufman concluded presciently that the presidency can elevate the most mediocre of men. But, they wrote, New York's mayoralty is, quote, the highly vulnerable symbol of all the defects in the city and its government. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.